Buchanan, the former director of the Kansas Geological Survey, and moderating this session this morning on water program updates. And our first presentation this morning is from Logan Smith, who is the Drinking Water Protection Program Coordinator at the Kansas Department of Health and Environment, position he's held since September of 2019. Prior to that, he worked as a hazardous waste permit writer in the Bureau of Waste Management. He has a Bachelor's of Science in Earth Science and a Master of Science in Physical Science with an Earth Science concentration, both from Emporia State University. So with that, I'll turn it over to Logan.
Thank you, Rex. Give me a second to share my screen. And are you seeing my title page?
We are, yeah. There you
Great. So yeah, thank you. I'm just going to give a quick overview of the Drinking Water Protection Program, its background, the process we go through, and the communities we're currently working with. So as Rex said, I've been the Drinking Water Protection Program Coordinator for just over 2 years now. And I'd say we've been up and running for just a little under that time. So Drinking Water Protection, or DWP as I'm going to refer to it throughout this PowerPoint, is a voluntary non-regulatory program at KDHE, which kind of makes us an oddball at the agency, but we like it that way. And our goal is to really help small communities throughout the state to prevent nitrate contamination in their respective public water supplies. And why that's our goal and why that's important is sort of twofold. First, it's health. As I'm sure as most people listening know, nitrates can be particularly deadly to infants. If consumed, it can cause blue baby syndrome. It can also be harmful to people with respiratory issues. And there have been a few studies linking large quantities of consumption of nitrates to cancer. So that's why the 10 milligrams per liter MCL was actually created. The second issue is financial. Obviously, communities are responsible for providing clean drinking water to their constituents. But if they go over that 10 milligram MCL enough times, they're often forced to put in a treatment plant. This treatment plant can cost up to $2 million to build, and it can cost up to potentially $1 million to operate and maintain. And you want to, keep in mind that we're working with communities that are 100, 200 people. So a treatment plant of that cost is just unfeasible. And really, as I said earlier, we are a preventative program, but there are a couple exceptions to that. So the communities we're working with can be put into two sort of categories. The communities that are trending up towards that MCL that haven't really gone over yet. And this is totally at the behest of the community. They see that they have a potential problem in the future, and they want to try and alleviate that problem. And these communities are truly voluntary. However, we do have a few communities that have already gone over into that MCL, and they are at the point where they had to sign a consent agreement with our public water supply at KDHE. This consent agreement is basically gives a timeline of what they need to do and how long they have until they have to alleviate those problems, whether that's treatment or recently working with us. And this next slide just gives kind of a detail of what I've just talked about. So these are nitrate concentrations taken from the state's Drinking Water Watch, which is public information. And we have two communities. On the left, you have the city of Dighton, and you can see that, for a while they were pretty steady, but the last couple of years they've gone up in nitrates. And they've agreed to work with us, and that's because they don't want to end up putting in a treatment plant, and we're working with them to try and reduce that nitrates concentration so they don't have to. On the right is another community we're working with, the city of Copeland. You can see in the last couple of years, they've gone above that 10 milligram MCL. So they are in a consent agreement, and they're currently working with us and trying to get below that again. But you can see, if this program existed back in 2012, well, they were at 6, going up to an 8. That's typically where we want to start talking to communities and start working with communities before they get into that, hit that 10. And so, if we existed back then, maybe we could have prevented this. So I'll start talking about our process. And when I talk about our process, phase 1 and phase 2, really phase 1 can be called, pre-commitment from a community, and phase 2 can be called post-commitment from a community. And what I mean by that is that when we first started, we were just sort of presenting the program as a whole to communities. And I don't think a lot of communities really wanted this whole hands-on deck from the get-go. So after that, we decided to offer, well, how about we provide a free assessment to you, the community, to get an idea of where the nitrates are around and in your town. And so far, that's been pretty successful. What that details is us putting a scope of work out to bid to third-party contractors to sample private irrigation, public water supply wells, typically within 2-mile radius of the public water supply wells of the community, to get an idea of the nitrate concentrations we're seeing around there. So once we put out the bid, a contractor is selected. They conduct recon, get an idea of where the wells are. Then they get permission from the well owners to conduct sampling. Once they sample, they collect those results and compile them into a comprehensive investigation report, or a CI report, which contains the recon info, sampling info, and results info. They send it back to us, we review it, and in time we approve it. Once the assessment's approved, we move into phase 2. We take that info from the CI report and write up a drinking water protection report, or DWPR. And really that's just DWP's version of the CI report, what the findings were. And it also talks a little bit about what joining DWP would entail and a local leadership team. So the DWPRs are presented at typically at the community city council meeting. And from there, the city council can elect whether or not they want to proceed with the program or not. If they elect to proceed, we ask that they form a local leadership team. And we ask that consists of producers in the area, business owners, city council members, and maybe parents of an infant, anyone who has vested interest in the drinking water of the community. Now, one real quick note is that, like I said earlier, DWP is a very new program at the agency. So we're kind of learning and adjusting as we proceed. Our DWPRs, I've had a few communities where I present to them this, and they actually are just more interested in what a plan would look like. So, if we're going to go ahead and proceed with the DWPRs or not, it's kind of up in the air. But for just the reason of this presentation, I kept it in there because we have presented them before and it's worked. But so once we get an LLT formed in the community, we start working on drinking water protection plan. This goes into background, BMP implementation, costs associated with those implementations, funding resources, etc. Once that's drafted, we present to the LLT and get their feedback and any edits. We also present a copy to a technical team, which is made up of experts from different state agencies like KDHE, KGS, KDA, federal agencies like USGS, universities like K-State or KU, and get their feedback and edits on it. Once we've received all the feedback and edits, we write up the plan, present it to the LLT again, and get their approval. From there, we start implementation. Now, Kansas being such a heavily agricultural state, when I talk about nitrates in public water supply, typically what I'm talking about is fertilizer usage, non-point source pollution. And to address that, we usually use best management practices, which can be divided into different categories: such as cropland. We're typically talking about cover crops, no-till, nutrient management, trying to build that organic matter in the soil so that we can lessen the reliance on fertilizer and see less leaching into the groundwater. Rangeland and grazing, rotational grazing, and work with any concentrated feedlots. But we also are talking about BMPs outside of agriculture, such as infrastructure. We're talking about, are there wells in the area that are unplugged, hand dug wells that might be leaching nitrates into the water source. We've also found that, many public water supply wells, especially ones that are older, were improperly built or constructed, and that they are actually leaching or potentially leaching nitrates into the groundwater source. We're also looking at wetland and playa restoration, especially in communities we're working with in Western Kansas. We're working with NGOs that work with playas, trying to get clean water, working with landowners who have playas, trying to get clean water, restoring those playas and getting clean water down into that groundwater faster so that we can dilute any legacy nitrates in the area. These are just a few of our strategies. And currently, this program is pretty lucky in that we have been provided a lot of funding from the legislature, who sees this as a really long-term investment for the viability of these small communities. So, and what, that funding so far has been that we can provide pretty much all of the funds for any agricultural based BMPs and a good portion of infrastructure as well. And where the LLT comes in to play in all the implementation is that they help gather information and education for us and for the community, and they help gather community support for the program. And obviously, once we begin implementation, we'll also want to monitor, how is our implementation doing? What that details is monitoring the public water supply well data, and also potentially any monitoring wells that may be in the area. And of course, this will allow us to test the effectiveness of our BMP implement and practices. If we find that community is increasing and all of a sudden for a while they've had just kind of a steady flat line or even decreasing, we know that our BMPs are working in those target areas. But if we're not seeing that, we're still seeing increases, obviously it would be time to reevaluate our BMPs and look at different target zones if needed. And here's just a map across the state of the current communities that we're working with. Those communities that are in blue dots, so we have Dighton, Copeland, Ford, Canopolis, and Palmer. Real quick, of those 5, Copeland and Ford are 2 communities that are in consent agreements, so that they have been over the MCL for a while. And then once they were presented with a consent agreement from our public water supply section in KDHE, they decided to go forward with our program rather than a different sort of avenue. But Dighton, Canopolis, and Palmer are both below that MCL, and they have just elected to proceed with us because they see it as the best interest and could save them a lot of money in the future. The red dots are Andale and Hoxie, and that kind of goes back to that drinking water protection report. Once I presented to them, they were more interested in seeing what a plan looked like, a little more detail. So I'm currently putting together those plans and will be scheduling meetings again in the future to get them on board. And those black dots are Sylvia and Isabel. They actually we haven't concluded assessments for them yet. Isabel just started. I just approved a work plan for them. And Sylvia, we're still waiting for consent from the community. But right now, as you probably figure out, we haven't really begun implementation yet. So far, I believe Palmer and Copeland we're pretty hopeful that we'll begin this upcoming spring. And that was a pretty quick presentation. Here's my contact info. And yeah, I'll take any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Logan. There was a question or two that showed up in the chat, but I think they've already been answered. If anybody else has other questions, the chat is probably the best way. Well, we'll take a few more minutes for questions here before we go on to the next presentation. Just real quickly, Logan, can you make a generalization about primary sources of nitrate that you're seeing the in this process?
Yeah, so I didn't mention it in the PowerPoint, but one thing that we do with all our communities is that we take an isotope sample from their public water supply wells, and that just kind of gives a real basic categorization of, is the fertilizer we're seeing, is the nitrate we're seeing in the public water supply non-organic, being fertilizer, or organic, being from animal waste or such. Usually what we see is non-organic fertilizer.
And obviously, part of the challenge here is the voluntary nature of what you're doing. There clearly is some motivation hanging over the heads of folks to be involved, but what is that primarily what drives the voluntary component of this is real interesting. Talk a little bit more about that and what works in terms of that conversation.
Yeah, so it's basically, you know, as I said, when a community sees that it's going, say they're at 6 MCL and they jump to 7 or 8 milligrams per liter, we tend to contact them because we know, they have to submit their results. And we talk to them about, what treatment would cost. And again, it goes back to a community that's only 200, 400 people, $2 million treatment plant plus $1 million a year to operate is just unfeasible. So usually this conversation happens with the city council, and they're usually aware of the problem. And so they're pretty willing to agree. But then there's another aspect of working with producers in the area who are applying this fertilizer. From there, that's often where our funding comes in, is that we are able, as of now, to help provide any assistance with, once they start applying cover crops, we realize that in the short term, they're going to have losses. We can help make up for those losses with our funding. In the long run, eventually they'll see gains just by, cutting their fertilizer loss down. That's probably the first two that come to mind.
Yeah, that voluntary component obviously leads to a lot of conversation, which is sounds like real critical to this
And
process.
I, and I should say real quick, Rex, that this program, I'm in the watershed management section at KDHE, which is also where RAPS is. So this program is heavily modeled after RAPS, which has been doing this for 20 years. And I ask them a lot of questions.
In the RAPS program, obviously real outreach, conversation oriented in this process. There is one last question on the chat function. Logan, has there actually been an uptick in blue baby syndrome diagnosis in those areas with elevated nitrates?
I have not looked at that. The communities when I talk to a community, it hasn't been brought up whether or not they've noticed that or anything. Like I said, hopefully we talk to them before anything like that happens. But in terms of the communities that are already above that MCL, they're required by law to provide bottled water to anyone who is at risk. And anyone who's at risk, they can refuse or accept it.
A lot of those are small enough communities that if they saw an uptick in issues, I would guess they would know pretty quickly. So,
Right.
yeah. Well, okay. Thank you, Logan. Let's go on to our next presentation, which is uh, Heidi Mehl and Laura Totten. Heidi, I see you on there. I'm not seeing, my screen may not be big enough to see everybody to see if Laura is on there or not. I'll go ahead with the introduction, then turn it over to you, Heidi. Uh, this next presentation is on sustainable river programs. It's Heidi Mehl and Laura Totten. Heidi is the Director of Water and Agricultural Programs at the Nature Conservancy. She's been researching water issues in Kansas and abroad since her undergraduate years at the University of Kansas. After receiving a BS and MA from KU, she received her PhD from the Department of Geography at K-State with a focus on fluvial geomorphology, nutrient cycling in riparian zones, and cultural aspects of water management and access to water resources. Her research has included partnerships with Friends of the Kaw, the Kansas Alliance for Wetlands and Streams, the Upper Wakarusa Reps, the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation, as well as Gorno-Altesk State University in Siberian Russia. Heidi is interested in understanding how changes to our landscape impact the quality and quantity of our water resources and the implications for both people and nature. Laura Totten is project manager planner for the Corps of Engineers Kansas City District. She's a 1997 graduate of Fort Hays State with an MS in biological sciences. She joined the Corps of Engineers in 2018. Prior to that, she had a number of years of experience in dealing with water issues. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Heidi, and we will go from there. So thank you all very much.
Thanks, Rex. And I saw in the chat that Laura is on. So I'm going to run through our slides, but Laura, is here to answer questions or contribute any information she might want to. So yeah, we're going to talk about the Sustainable Rivers Program. This is our, I believe, 4th year of the program. And our title slide shows some of our key partners, but this isn't even close to all of the different agencies and organizations that have been involved and have given us input on this program. So I really thank everyone for your involvement in this program. So I'll start out with some definitions. What is the Sustainable Rivers Program? It is a nationwide partnership between the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Nature Conservancy. The focus is on modifying operations at Corps-operated dams to restore some degree of a river's natural flow pattern and enhance habitat conditions. And so in Kansas, that looks like the Corps, the Kansas Water Office, the Nature Conservancy, and other partners working together to create, implement, and monitor an environmental flow management plan. And some definitions of environmental flows or E-flows, you can look at it a couple of different ways. There's an ecological definition, which is the quantity, timing, and quality of water flows required to sustain freshwater and estuarine ecosystems and the human livelihoods and well-being that depend on these ecosystems. And then our operational definition is management decisions that manipulate water and land-water interactions to achieve ecological or environmental goals. And so the important point here is that we are not trying to restore the 100% natural flow regime to these rivers. That's really unattainable with the degree of control on the rivers and the degree of needed control for water supply and flood control. But we are trying to get to that operational definition of environmental flows where we are working within those operational constraints of the system to try to get those ecological flow components back into the system whenever and wherever possible. Why E-flows? Why would we care about doing this? The body of literature demonstrates that restoring some degree of a river's natural flow pattern is the best way to protect and restore river health and functioning sediment regimes, water quality, and aquatic riparian habitat. The flow regime is a master variable. It affects everything. It cues fish to spawn. It can cue stages of insect life cycles. It affects mussel habitat. It affects bed sediment transport, nutrient cycling. And so restoring as much as we can of some variability of natural flow regime will benefit all of these different indicators of ecological health. This hydrograph is from the Des Moines River below Red Rock, which is another Sustainable Rivers Program site. But I put it up here because I like it as a graphical representation of what I described on the last slide. So it shows sort of your high seasonal and low flow events in the background there, and what during each season, what those flow events might be triggering or cueing in the river system. And so, you know, when you look at a controlled system, once a dam or a number of dams have gone onto a system, the effect is really to knock off a lot of this variability, especially in those high flows. So when you see the hydrograph for a controlled river, you're not going to see as much of the spiky, you know, variability and changes in flow, magnitude, and duration as much as you would in an uncontrolled system. The Kansas River is really unique in terms of the Sustainable Rivers program because the reservoirs that we are working on are not on the main stem of the Kansas River, like they are on the Des Moines or the Roanoke or some of these other big rivers. So you see a much more pronounced controlling effect when the dam is actually on the main stem. But for us, we have uncontrolled tributaries contributing to flow on the Kansas, as well as tributaries that do have that reservoir control on them. There's a 3-step process that has been defined for this program: advance, implement, and incorporate. And so advancing is just that stage where you are engaging stakeholders, engaging all of the stakeholders in that process of, you know, reviewing the available literature and discussing the flow needs and defining the flow needs of the system. Implementation involves when you're ready to actually go in and implement a prescribed flow plan at a reservoir and test the effectiveness and the feasibility of those defined flows that the stakeholder group has come up with. And then finally, and you might go back and forth between advance and implement for quite a while before you finally get to incorporate, which means, you know, everybody has agreed on this flow prescription. It's reaching the desired outcomes. And those environmental flow strategies are now included in reservoir operations policies, such as water control manuals. This map shows the rivers that are part of the program across the United States. And I will say this program has expanded quite a bit. It started out with a pretty low level of funding, and funding has really grown exponentially in the last 2 years or so. And so we're able to include more rivers in the program. So for Kansas, we have the Kansas River Basin shown here in orange, that's in the advanced stage. And then the Osage River, when this map was created, it was a proposed river, but it was accepted late last year, I believe. And so we're at the very beginning of working on this project with the Osage and the Meredith. Just in case anybody on the call doesn't know the Kansas River Basin, here it is. All of the northern half of Kansas, eastern Colorado, and southern Nebraska. But here's a little better map that shows the reservoirs that are part of this system and part of the Sustainable Rivers program. And to start on the Kansas River, we really focused on the 4 on the main stem: Clinton, Perry, Tuttle, and Milford. But part of our next steps as we move past the e-flow workshop and get into that implementation phase for those 4 is to start including or looking at information on these smaller reservoirs in the headwaters or contributing tributaries. And then our other project, the new one, the Meredith. This one is a partnership with Missouri, and of course the Kansas City District of the Corps covers both sides of the state line. And so on the Kansas side, this will focus on Melbourne, Pomona, and Hillsdale. And then we have a couple of the large main stem dams to work on the Missouri side at Truman and Lake of the Ozarks, as well as Stockton and Pomme de Terre. Okay, so this is our process. The first process is the stakeholder identification and orientation meeting. Then you move to literature review and summary report. And then once you have all of the literature available to review, you send it out to the stakeholders and you hold that e-flow workshop. After the e-flow workshop, develop a report, coordinate with water managers and stakeholders. That's a really important part of this. We don't want to leave anybody behind or leave anybody wondering how this is going to affect their water right, or whatever stake they might hold in the system. So coordination with water managers and stakeholders. And then once the flow recommendations and needs of the stakeholders are sort of resolved, we can move to implementation of flow prescriptions and data collection and research, because we want to monitor what the outcomes are of those flow prescriptions. And so this is sort of an iterative process. I included the arrow here to show that as we collect data and see whether we're reaching our desired outcomes or not, we might go back and have another eFlow workshop at some point. And so, it's not one and done. It's a continuous, monitoring of a system, because these are big, complex systems. So we have to be sure that we're reaching those outcomes that we intend to. Okay, so for the Kansas River, we've done the stakeholder identification, the literature review, and the first eFlow workshop. And I put the arrow kind of in between that step 3 and step 4 to show that that's sort of where we are on the process. We are just wrapping up the report reviews for the first eFlow workshop and getting feedback on that, and are discussing actually holding a second eFlow workshop to resolve some maybe disagreements between ecological targets on the Kansas River. But once we hold that second eFlow workshop, we'll move on to coordination with the water managers and stakeholders. And I wanted to give you guys kind of an insight into what came out of the eFlow workshop. And this will be shared more broadly, like I said, as we sort of resolve these recommendations and get feedback from stakeholders. But the eFlow workshop uses this program called the regime prescription tool that allows us to model different hydrographs based on different conditions and different ecological targets. And so for the Kansas River, we divided into a group working on fish species and the needs of the fish in the river and mussels. And then the second group was working on sandbar nesting birds, shorebirds that might utilize the Kansas River corridor, and riparian and floodplain systems, including sandbar creation and maintenance. And it was interesting because we had 2 breakout groups. And so we came back together and compared what each group had come up with. And so you can see the fish group, and this is for a wet year. That's another important point, that there are different prescriptions for wet years, average years, and dry years. And so for a wet year in the same reach, the fish group recommended sort of a large pulse in March, and then continuing pulses throughout the spawning season in the summer. That partially matched up with the recommendations from the bird and riparian group that also recommended a larger pulse in the early spring to sort of clear off those sandbars, prepare them for the incoming sandbar nesting birds. But there's also maybe a disagreement here on whether there should be pulses for fish spawning or low flows to keep those sandbars clear for nesting during that May-June period. So that's one of the things that might need to be resolved. But the bird and riparian group, thought occasional pulses throughout the system would help.
Because I can't, okay. Oh,
It's okay. Would help sort of pull in that allochthonous energy into the system and assist with some of the nutrient cycling, and maybe some small fall pulses to flush and freshen the system. The Osage River, like I said, is brand new into the program. So we've really just done that step 1 stakeholder identification and are working on the literature review and summary report right now. And so if Laura has anything to add, Laura, I'd welcome you to add any comments right now, or I'll take any questions that anybody might have. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Heidi.
I don't have anything to add right now, but be happy to help answer any questions.
Well, okay, I think I have a question here just to start with.
Sure.
In terms of, and this will involve both of you, describe a little bit then about the interaction between the Corps and TNC in this process. Obviously, two very different organizations. So, how do the two of them fit together in this process?
That's a really good question, Rex. I think, from my perspective, we came together around a set of shared goals. And I, when this program first kind of came across my radar, I wasn't sure what the Corps would think about it or whether they would want to participate, but found some very willing participation, some very eager excitement about the possibilities here. And so, these dams are operated by the Corps. The Kansas Water Office is also a really key player there for coordination. So the Nature Conservancy recognizes that we don't rise to that level of stakeholder in this, but I think what we bring is an opportunity for stakeholder coordination and scientific expertise to help inform the e-flow plan.
And Laura, any thoughts there?
I think Heidi's captured it really well. The two organizations working in partnership with maybe differing levels of expertise or stakeholder groups that we normally work with, but the two together just kind of expand that out to encompass a more comprehensive set of stakeholders and groups and scientists and ways of looking at things. So it's a really fantastic working relationship for us. And there's many rivers across the United States and this SRP program is continuing to kind of expand out into other rivers just because of the momentum that's getting behind some of these current SRP projects. So it really works well for the two organizations to work together in partnership with many other people that are needed to make these things happen.
And Heidi, can you see there's a question on the chat? I'll go ahead and read it for you. Have you looked at ways to introduce additional sediment into the Kansas River to restore historic sediment levels that are now trapped behind dams?
Yeah, Mike, that's a really good question. And, I'll let Laura address this, but I think the one that comes to mind for me is the WID, the water injection dredging pilot that they're preparing to do at Tuttle. And we've talked about how that might be paired with the Sustainable Rivers program to sort of encourage the movement of that sediment downstream instead of having it settle out maybe somewhere undesirable. Could we manipulate those flushes of sediment with the Sustainable Rivers program to sort of get a more even distribution in the receiving streams downstream?
Yeah, and I can just add to that with some of the SRP funding that we have annual funding, we've been able to, with help from John Shelley, conduct and put on a turbidity workshop that some people attended, and we've also been able to help fund some literature review and research through our engineering research division, ERDIC, out of Mississippi, to look at the turbidity needs of the fishes in the Kansas, primarily in the Kansas River, but other rivers too, and finding out that there are some species who will thrive with more turbidity, and there are some that it could harm as well. So just trying to figure out what that means if more sediment is released downstream through whatever action, whether it be hydrosuction or whitting or whatever out of, say, Tuttle. So just trying to figure out what that would mean to the species, and then hopefully carrying it just a little bit further into the water quality realm of what that might mean too as well.
Okay, thank you, Laura. I have a couple other questions then, and again, if folks want to put questions into the chat function. This sort of connects up with Logan's presentation prior, but how do you go about identifying stakeholders and making sure you're getting the right people at the table? And is there reluctance, or is that combination of a private organization in the TNC with an agency in the form of the Corps, does that pretty much cover the waterfront, or how do you identify people you need to bring to the table?
That's another really good question. We tried to be really inclusive with this. And so one of the first stages that we did with the Kansas River was to create a sort of a team charter of, the core team that's responsible for deliverables, the steering committee, which was all of the agencies and organizations that we thought, was important to have their input and scientific expertise, and then a list of stakeholders that we wanted to be sure that we include them throughout the process to give their input, to make sure that they know what we're doing. And so, and we did look at environmental groups, recreational groups, industry on the river, water rights holders. We included the Water Assurance District, Bowersock Dam, pretty much everyone we could think of. And our team charter ended up being huge. And it felt a bit unruly for a little while. But I'm glad we did it that way, because I think there was some benefit to having that level of information out there and making sure that everyone knew what this was, and also what it's not, because you start talking about changing reservoir operations, and there's all sorts of questions about, well, what does that mean? How is that going to affect me? And so I think an important point for us to get out there was that this is not a reallocation of water rights. It's not a reallocation of purchased storage in the reservoir. It's not a change in the project purposes of the dam. The dams are still there for navigation and flood control and water supply and recreation. And this program has to take all of those operational purposes into account and look at opportunities, within those operational constraints to achieve these environmental flows.
And can you just ballpark for me what total number of organizations, people, was it the total number of people that came to the table in that process?
That is a really good question. I would put it at 40 to 50.
Okay.
Maybe more when you include all of the stakeholders. It was quite a few. Yep.
Another question on the chat for Laura: will the water for any enhanced flows come out of Tuttle Creek water quality storage pool?
Well, that is really to be determined where any water would come from, and would be discussed in, very comprehensively with water managers and stakeholders. But I will say our first, what I call environmental flows workshop that we focused on the area closely below Tuttle and Milford, and we call it Reach 2, and it's on the Kansas River. It's from the Big Blue River confluence to Willard, so below Milford and Tuttle. So thinking that, we'd have maybe more opportunity to have enhanced flows for the environmental flows from one or the other, Milford or Tuttle, or both in tandem somehow. But again, when you do the eFlows workshop, you kind of work outside of the box of thinking about the stakeholder group, or other groups. At that point, you kind of think about, if you had a magic wand and you wanted to benefit the ecology, what would you do? But knowing going into that you don't have a magic wand, and there are a lot of other human considerations that you need to do. So as we move past now into this next phase, which is the implementation, coordination and implementation planning, there'll be extensive outreach and discussions with various individuals, with water management, and the stakeholder groups as well. But Mike, I guess a shorter answer would be potentially, but some of them could come out of the water quality storage pool at Tuttle, depending on how the coordination goes and what we end up with.
And we're getting close to the end of time here. One of the questions I had is there any conversation about extending this program to the Arkansas River drainage, Heidi?
There has been some discussion about expanding it possibly to the Neosho. probably shouldn't say that because it's not a done deal yet, but that has been floated as an idea. And I think the Neosho would be a good candidate. I'm not sure about the ARC. That really hasn't come up in discussion. And that one seems like it would be challenging.
Yeah, I will say every year, the way the SRP program works is that they're funded annually, and every year they accept proposals from, they usually reach out to their core count, it's the Institute of Water Resources that manages it, which is a part of the core, but they reach out to all of the districts and they say, working with your partners, do you have anything that you'd like to propose under SRP? So there's opportunities to propose, and what they do is they take all of these proposals and they they have a review process and a selection process for that too. But if you can show there's a need for it and you have the right support behind it, I think there's always opportunity, Rex, for that. But it's a process, and but the door is open, I guess, if it's something that somebody wanted to get behind.
And the other thing I would add there is that currently the Bureau of Reclamation is not part of the program. There have been some discussions about trying to incorporate Bureau of Rec dams into the program and get them on board as a partner, but I don't believe they are yet, right, Laura?
They are not. We have done some what we call Section 7 coordination with the Bureau just to introduce them to SRP. In the Kansas River Basin, primarily working with the folks out of Nebraska with the U.S. Bureau, but they've been introduced to it. And, for the Kansas River SRP, potentially there could be some benefits out of Wakanda, which we added some information with this extension of the geographic scope up the contributing tributaries recently. And that's something I think we could talk about in a second EFOS workshop is there, could there be any benefits out of Wakanda on that reach on the Solomon or even down into the Kansas? So that's yet to be seen how willing they are to help discuss these things and partner on them.
It looks like we are out of time. I appreciate Logan and Heidi and Laura and all of you. And with that, I think we're done. It's good conversation about particularly how to involve a variety of folks in dealing with what are important water issues. So with that, thank you again. And I think we're ready to close the session.